dreams left.
God against his my trigger, now he's dead.
Looking for the right time, but the right time never comes.
In 1998, during what appeared to be a routine MTV interview, the lead singer of one of the most powerful heavy metal bands ever assembled casually disclosed something he had concealed from his bandmates, his fans, and the world for the entire duration of his career. That was not an isolated moment. Across rock and heavy metal, genres that have spent decades projecting a very specific and deliberately narrow idea of identity, a parallel history runs underneath the official one. This is that history. 17 musicians, their actual stories, and what it took for each of them to be known as themselves. If you're into real stories like this, the ones the industry doesn't talk about, subscribe to Metal Icons, because these aren't just music stories. These are the truths behind the legends. 1. Rob Halford, Judas Priest.
Look at me, I'm chasing after dreams left.
Rob Halford did not simply front Judas Priest. He defined what a heavy metal frontman looked like for an entire generation of musicians and fans. The black leather, the chrome studs, the motorcycle ridden onto the stage, the voice that operated across a range most singers cannot access. All of it became the visual and sonic template for the genre. He is referred to within the metal world as the metal god, and that designation is not hyperbole, given what he built. The gap between that image and what Halford was managing privately represents one of the more extraordinary sustained concealments in popular music history. He is gay. He knew it throughout the decades in which Judas Priest built their reputation. Throughout the 1970s recording sessions, throughout the massive arena tours of the 1980s, throughout every interview in which the band's toughness and power were the central subjects of discussion. His reasoning was specific, and he has articulated it clearly in subsequent interviews. He believed that disclosure would end the band. The music world of the 1970s and 1980s provided him with no evidence to suggest that belief was wrong. He made the calculation that concealment was the cost of the band's survival, and he paid it for decades. The disclosure came in 1998 during an MTV interview. He mentioned it in a matter-of-fact way. The interviewer was visibly unprepared. The coverage that followed reflected the genuine surprise of an industry that had not seen it coming, despite, in retrospect, having been given considerable evidence throughout Halford's career that the leather and studs image contained more personal meaning than it appeared to on the surface. The fan response was largely supportive. The band continued. His standing within the metal world was not destroyed. The thing he had spent decades protecting turned out to be more durable than he had been able to believe while he was hiding. 2. Freddie Mercury, Queen.
God against his my trigger, now he's dead.
Mercury's personal life was managed with sustained and deliberate privacy. He was in a long-term relationship with Mary Austin beginning in the early 1970s, and Austin remained his closest personal relationship for the rest of his life. She was the primary beneficiary of his estate. He described her in interviews as his common-law wife. As his understanding of his own attraction to men developed, he navigated those relationships quietly and outside the public eye. He did not come out publicly. He did not make statements about his sexuality in interviews. He allowed the public narrative about his personal life to remain ambiguous rather than corrected, and he maintained that ambiguity through the peak years of Queen's global fame. What was known within his inner circle was a separate matter from what was available to the public. His close friends and collaborators understood his private life. That knowledge was not shared externally. He exercised the same degree of control over what was known about him personally as he exercised over every other element of his professional presentation. He died in November 1991, one day after confirming publicly that he had AIDS. The disclosure came 24 hours before the end. He had known his diagnosis for years and had managed it privately while continuing to record. The Made in Heaven album, completed posthumously from recordings made during his final years, documents a voice still functioning at a high level in a body that was failing. 3. Doug Pinnick, King's X.
Looking for the right time, but the right time never comes.
King's X occupy a specific and respected position in the architecture of progressive and alternative metal. Their musical construction, the combination of heavy guitar riffs, Doug Pinnick's bass playing, and his vocal instrument, which is unusually soulful for a genre that does not typically prioritize that quality, were central to what made the band distinctive. King's X also developed a significant audience within Christian rock communities. That audience represented a real and important part of the band's following. Pinnick is gay. The combination of circumstances he was navigating, the heavy metal world's cultural conservatism around masculinity and sexuality, and the specific expectations of a Christian rock audience made his situation unusually constrained. Both communities, from his vantage point, provided reasons for concealment. He was not in a position to be himself in either direction. He came out in 1998, the same year as Rob Halford, in an interview. The response from portions of the Christian audience that had followed King's X was negative in ways he had anticipated. Other fans supported him. His relationship with his own faith and his identity has been an ongoing subject of his music and public conversation since. Not resolved cleanly, but engaged with directly and honestly, which is more than the alternative would have allowed. 4. Marcy Free, King Cobra. Mark Free was among the most technically capable vocalists working in the glam metal world of the 1980s. His range, which extended into the upper registers that the genre demanded, placed him in demand across multiple projects. He fronted King Cobra, the band assembled by drummer Carmine Appice. He sang for Signal and Unruly Child. He was regarded within industry circles as a premier vocalist for the style. What he was managing privately was not a question of sexual orientation. It was something more fundamental. Mark Free experienced gender dysphoria, the persistent condition in which a person's internal sense of their gender does not correspond to the gender they were assigned at birth. He had experienced this throughout his life, including throughout the years in which he was building a career in one of the most aggressively masculine-coded music scenes ever to exist. She stepped away from the music world in the 1990s and began transitioning. She chose the name Marcy Free. She later returned to recording and performing, making her voice, which remained intact and powerful, available to audiences with the full context of who she actually was. Her story is an early and significant one in the history of transgender visibility in rock music. 5. Mina Caputo, Life of Agony.
Destined to be everything.
Life of Agony emerged from Brooklyn in the early 1990s with a sound that positioned them at the intersection of alternative metal and hardcore. Their emotional directness, particularly on their debut album River Runs Red, the band's reach extended well beyond their scene, with touring slots alongside Metallica and Ozzy Osbourne, exposing them to massive mainstream audiences. The voice at the center of that band was known publicly as Keith Caputo, presented as a tough, emotionally open, but male frontman from a working-class Brooklyn background. That presentation was true in some dimensions and concealing in others. Mina Caputo had understood her identity as female throughout her life and throughout the years in which Life of Agony were building their following. The image the band's success required her to maintain, the tough male frontman from a hard neighborhood, was in direct conflict with who she was. She maintained it. She continued touring and recording within that framework while managing internally what she could not express externally. In 2011, she announced publicly that she is transgender and would be living as Mina Caputo. She continued to front Life of Agony. Her voice, which had always been the band's most distinctive element, remained the center of their sound. The response within the metal community was mixed, but included significant support, including from fans for whom her announcement represented a visibility they had not expected to find in that genre. 6. Laura Jane Grace. Against Me. Against Me built their reputation from the ground up, beginning in Gainesville, Florida, playing anarchist and squatter spaces, releasing music independently, and developing a following through years of constant touring and a reputation for genuine commitment to the politics their music described. By the mid-2000s, they had become one of the most prominent punk bands of their generation, signed to a major label and playing to substantially larger audiences than their DIY origins had suggested was coming. The figure at the front of that band was known as Tom Gaahl, a songwriter whose willingness to engage with personal and political subjects directly had been central to Against Me's credibility with their audience. The honesty of the songwriting was part of the band's identity. Laura Jane Grace had experienced gender dysphoria throughout her life and throughout the years of Against Me's growth. The pressure of managing that privately while fronting a band, while being a public figure with a documented and analyzed body of work, while being the person that Against Me's audience had developed a relationship with, was something she described in subsequent interviews and in her memoir as a continuous and significant weight. In 2012, she came out as a transgender woman in an interview with Rolling Stone. She wrote songs directly about her experience of transition, her relationship with her own history, and what it meant to be known publicly as herself. The album that followed her announcement, Transgender Dysphoria Blues, was critically well received and is considered one of the more significant records in punk music of that decade. She was among the first major rock artists to come out as transgender publicly and continue their career with their existing band and audience. 7. Wendy O. Williams. The Plasmatics. Wendy O. Williams fronted the Plasmatics from the late 1970s through the mid-1980s and occupied a position in the rock world that had no real precedent and produced no real successor. The band's live performances were built around deliberate destruction, televisions destroyed with sledgehammers, guitars cut apart with chainsaws, automobiles detonated on stage. The visual language was confrontational in ways that went significantly beyond what most shock rock acts were attempting at the time. Williams's personal identity reflected the same refusal to accept externally imposed categories that characterized everything else about her public life. She was bisexual and had relationships with both men and women. She did not treat this as a disclosure requiring management. She simply lived without compartmentalizing it or offering it as a statement intended for public consumption. It was part of who she was in the same way that everything else about her was part of who she was, without apology and without the performance of explanation. In the hard rock world of the late 1970s and early 1980s, this was not a common approach. Most artists who were not straight were managing that information carefully. Williams did not manage it. She existed openly and let the world respond to that existence on her terms rather than negotiating in advance with its expectations. She was a direct precursor to every subsequent conversation in rock and metal about gender, identity, and what a woman performing in heavy music was allowed to be and do. That precedent is not sufficiently acknowledged in most historical treatments of the era. 8. Joan Jett, The Runaways / Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. Joan Jett's career began in the Runaways, an all-female rock band formed in Los Angeles in the mid-1970s when Jett was a teenager. After the band dissolved in 1979, she formed Joan Jett and the Blackhearts and built a second and larger career as a solo artist with I Love Rock and Roll, a recording that became one of the most recognizable rock songs of the 1980s, and Bad Reputation among the defining records of her catalog. Her image was constructed around a very specific and deliberately maintained set of elements: the black leather jacket, the black hair, the Les Paul guitar, the direct and unapologetic presentation of someone who did not require anyone's approval. That image was not a departure from who she is. It is a consistent expression of values she has held and demonstrated throughout her career. Questions about her personal life, and specifically about her sexuality, have accompanied her entire career. Her answer has been consistent for decades. She does not discuss it. She has stated explicitly that she believes a person's romantic and sexual life is their own business and has no necessary relationship to their public work or identity. She does not frame this as concealment. She frames it as a principled position about what public figures owe the public, which is her music and her performances, and nothing more. 9. Joe Briggs. Joe Briggs arrived in the early 1970s with a level of promotional investment behind him that suggested his record label was confident they had found something commercially viable. There were billboard advertisements in Times Square. There were full-page magazine ads. The framing positioned him as an American equivalent of David Bowie, a theatrical, piano-based songwriter who could carry the glam rock moment into new commercial territory. What separated Briggs from virtually every other rock artist of that era was not his music or his appearance. It was that he was openly and explicitly gay from the beginning of his career and made his identity a central element of his public presentation. He did not manage it quietly or allow it to remain ambiguous. He stated it directly and framed it as something he was not willing to treat as secondary to the music. His career as a major label priority ended quickly. He continued working on smaller scales. For years, his story was filed under cautionary tales about overhyped artists who did not connect. The reassessment that has come in subsequent decades positions him differently, as someone who was doing something specific and meaningful that the context of his era made commercially impossible, not because it was wrong, but because it was early. The musicians who came after him operated in a landscape he had some hand in making, even though he received none of the benefit of that change during his commercial prime. 10. Roddy Bottum. Faith No More. Faith No More's commercial breakthrough in the late 1980s and early 1990s came from their successful synthesis of elements that had not previously been combined in a mainstream rock context. Heavy metal guitar, funk-influenced rhythm, hip-hop cadences, and keyboard textures that drew from art rock and electronic music simultaneously. The result was a sound that was genuinely difficult to place within existing genre categories, and that found a large mainstream audience despite or because of that difficulty. Roddy Bottum's keyboard work was architecturally essential to that sound. The specific quality of his contributions, the textures he chose, the harmonic decisions he made, the way his keyboard parts interacted with the guitar and rhythm section, was what made Faith No More sound like Faith No More, rather than like any of the other alternative metal bands working in the same period. The significance of the timing was considerable. Faith No More were at the peak of their commercial visibility in 1993. Very few musicians in bands of that scale and in that genre had made similar disclosures at comparable moments in their careers. Bottum did it without apparent anxiety about the commercial consequences, which was itself notable given the context. On Birinci Bob Mould, Husker Du. Husker Du's position in the history of American alternative rock is foundational. The band operated in Minneapolis in the early and mid-1980s and produced a series of recordings, Zen Arcade, New Day Rising, Flip Your Wig, that demonstrated that hardcore punk's energy and indie rock's melodic sensibility could function together rather than in opposition. The bands that followed them include Nirvana, the Pixies, and essentially every alternative rock act that built careers in the late 1980s and 1990s. That lineage is not contested among people who study this music seriously. Bob Mould was the band's guitarist, primary songwriter, and one of its two vocalists. His guitar playing, loud, distorted, melodically rich underneath the noise, and his songwriting, which engaged with emotional experience in ways that felt personal rather than performed, were central to what made Husker Du matter. He is gay. During the years of Husker Du's existence and through his subsequent work with Sugar and his solo career, he kept his personal life out of public discussion. He was intensely private about matters he considered to belong to him rather than to his audience. 12. Billie Joe Armstrong. Green Day. Green Day's commercial trajectory is one of the more unusual in rock music history. A band that emerged from the East Bay, California punk underground, achieved mainstream breakthrough in 1994 with Dookie, sustained that position through multiple decades, and then achieved a second commercial peak in 2004 with American Idiot, a record that functioned simultaneously as a pop-punk album and a political statement about the United States in the immediate post-9/11 period. Armstrong has been the band's primary songwriter and frontman throughout. The lack of sustained attention to a disclosure that has been on the public record for 30 years is itself informative. Armstrong made no effort to hide this information. The information was simply not processed by a media environment and public that defaulted to heterosexual assumptions about married male frontmen of major rock bands. His consistent openness about the subject in a context where that openness was not generating significant coverage or cultural attention represents a different kind of visibility than the dramatic coming out moment. It was quiet, persistent, and largely ignored, which made it in some ways more honest than a managed public disclosure would have been. 13. Paul Masvidal. Cynic. Cynic's influence on technical and progressive metal is the kind that musicians understand more fully than casual listeners. Their 1993 debut album, Focus, released during Masvidal's brief period as a member of Death, one of the defining bands of technical death metal, demonstrated that the genre's approach to heaviness and complexity could absorb jazz harmony, ambient texture, and a vocal approach influenced by processed and robotic sound design. The result was music that found its audience slowly and had been consistently influential in the decades since its release. Masvidal's guitar playing operates at a technical level that positions him among the most accomplished players in metal, and his compositional decisions reflect an engagement with music theory and jazz that is unusual in extreme metal contexts. He is gay. The extreme metal world of the 1990s, in which he built his reputation, was not a cultural environment that offered much latitude for that disclosure. The masculinity codes of the scene were rigid, and the community was not, at that time, one that had developed frameworks for this kind of visibility. 14. Sean Reinert. Cynic/Death. Sean Reinert's technical achievements as a drummer are the kind that serious drummers reference as benchmarks. His work on Death's Human album, recorded in 1991, demonstrated a facility with jazz-influenced rhythmic complexity within an extreme metal context that had not previously been achieved at that level. The album is widely considered one of the most technically sophisticated recordings in death metal history, and Reinert's drumming is central to why it occupies that position. He was also the drummer for Cynic throughout their most significant period, and his rhythmic approach there, which incorporated further jazz influence alongside the technical demands of progressive metal, was equally distinctive. He was gay. Like Masvidal, he maintained that privacy throughout the years in which his musical reputation was being established, and came out alongside his bandmate in the 2014 Los Angeles Times interview. His death in January 2020 removed one of the genuinely irreplaceable technical voices in metal drumming. The fact that he spent the final 6 years of his life having been publicly known as himself, after the decades during which he had not, is something that his collaborators and the people close to him have noted as significant. 15. Gaahl. Gorgoroth. Gorgoroth are among the most prominent bands in Norwegian black metal, a genre defined by its deliberate extremity, Musically, visually, and in terms of the ideological positions its most dedicated practitioners have publicly espoused. The genre's public culture has been, historically, one of the most aggressively conservative and hostile spaces in extreme music. Gaahl, the stage name of Christian Espadal, served as Gorgoroth's vocalist for the period encompassing some of the band's most high-profile activity. His physical presentation, vocal approach, and public persona were constructed around an image of darkness and menace that placed him near the center of what black metal was understood to represent visually. He is gay. In 2008, he was featured in a documentary in which he appeared with his partner. He subsequently addressed his identity directly in interviews, doing so in a characteristically direct and unemotional manner consistent with his general public presentation. He did not frame it as a dramatic personal revelation. He stated it as a fact about himself. The response within the black metal community was significant and divided in ways that reflected the scene's internal tensions around its own ideological commitments. 16. Genesis P-Orridge, Throbbing Gristle / Psychic TV. The question of how to write about Genesis P-Orridge within a format structured around genre categories is itself instructive, because P-Orridge spent their entire career systematically dismantling the frameworks that genre categories represent. Throbbing Gristle, co-founded by P-Orridge in 1975, is credited with creating industrial music, a form that treated noise, found sound, and deliberate aesthetic discomfort as primary materials rather than as things to be avoided or minimized in the production of music. The band's work was not simply unusual. It was a programmatic rejection of the assumptions that governed what music was supposed to do and be. The frame that makes the most sense for P-Orridge's life and work is not the coming-out narrative that applies to many others on this list. She was not concealing an identity and then disclosing it. She was actively constructing and deconstructing identity as the central subject and practice of everything she did. The questions she raised about what a person is, what gender is, and what the relationship between self and body actually consists of were not resolved in her work. They were kept open deliberately and permanently. She died in 2020. The body of work she left as a musician, as a visual artist, as a writer, and as a public intellectual on questions of identity and consciousness continues to generate engagement from artists and thinkers working across multiple disciplines. 17. Otep Shamaya. Otep. Otep Shamaya founded and has fronted Otep since the band's formation in Los Angeles in 2000. The band's placement within the nu metal and alternative metal landscape of the early 2000s gave them access to mainstream rock audiences through label support and festival appearances. But the content of Shamaya's work was not calibrated to the expectations of mainstream metal in the ways that most commercially successful bands in that space were. Her vocal approach, which shifts between clean singing, spoken word performance, and aggressive screaming within single songs, and her lyrical engagement with abuse, trauma, political violence, and personal resilience made Otep something other than a genre exercise. The work reflected specific experiences and specific commitments. Shamaya is a lesbian and has been openly so from the beginning of her public career. There was no period of concealment followed by disclosure. She was visible in this regard from the start and made her identity part of her artistic and political work rather than separating it from either. Her position in the history of heavy metal is that of someone who refused to treat visibility as something to be earned incrementally or as a reward for commercial success. She started with it. That decision, made at the beginning of a career in a genre structured around specific expectations about who got to be visible and on what terms, is a significant part of what her career represents. The 17 people documented in this script operated across 5 decades, multiple countries, and essentially every major genre that grew out of rock and heavy metal, from glam to black metal, from punk to industrial, from progressive death metal to alternative rock. The specific circumstances of each of their stories are different. The cultural environments they navigated had different rules and different consequences for deviation from those rules. Subscribe to Metal Icons, because sometimes the real story